The room was silent, save for the low, humless vibration of the cooling vents. Mark sat at his desk, his fingers hovering inches above the keyboard, but he did not type. He stared at the monitor. It was a flat, black void, reflecting nothing but the dim light of the overhead lamp. He tapped the space bar. Nothing. He clicked the mouse. The cursor remained frozen in the center of the display. Then, the silence broke. A sharp, rhythmic pulse of light emerged from the bottom corner of the glass. It was a deep, urgent red, blinking with the steady cadence of a heartbeat. Mark leaned forward, his eyes tracking the light. A text box materialized over the darkness, glowing with clinical precision. Subscription expired. Please renew your hardware-as-a-service plan to resume processing. The words hung in the air, demanding attention. Mark exhaled, a long, slow sound that vanished into the quiet of the room. He reached for the power button, but his hand stopped mid-air. He watched the red light pulse again, casting a faint, crimson hue across his palms. Mark moved his cursor to the flashing renew button. He did not hesitate. His finger pressed down, a sharp, singular click that echoed in the quiet room. On the screen, a progress bar appeared, thin and sterile. He watched as the numbers in his digital wallet ticked downward. £10 vanished, wiped from his account in a fraction of a second. The system hung for a heartbeat, the progress bar stalling at 99%. Mark held his breath, his gaze locked on the pixelated line. Then, the bar vanished. The screen flickered, a sudden blinding white flash. Icons snapped into place. The wallpaper loaded. The hum of the cooling fans returned, a low, mechanical drone. He was back in control, but the victory felt hollow. He moved the mouse, and the cursor glided across the desktop. He had paid for the right to work for another month. He leaned back, his chair creaking, and stared at the desktop. Mark turned his gaze toward the corner of the room, away from the glowing monitor. He thought of his father's old machine, a heavy beige tower that had sat in the study for a decade. It was a monolith of plastic and steel, scarred by scratches and dust, but it remained constant. It never demanded a subscription. It never flickered out of existence because a payment failed. It just existed, waiting for the press of a button. He remembered the sound of the mechanical hard drive spinning up, a rhythmic, grinding noise that signaled the machine was truly his. Today, that tower would be a museum piece, a relic of a forgotten era of ownership. Mark looked down at his own desk. It was clean, minimalist, and entirely empty of substance. He ran his hand over the surface of his current workstation, feeling the cool, smooth plastic of a chassis he was merely borrowing. He did not own the processor, or even the power supply. He was renting the right to render pixels, a temporary tenant in a digital space. He was a subscriber to his own life. Mark looked at the GPU status panel on his monitor. It was a sleek, digital interface displaying real-time clock speeds and thermal loads. He did not own the silicon inside the chassis. He rented the right to render pixels, a service calculated in milliseconds. The hardware was a tethered slave to a remote server. If the connection dropped or the payment failed, the device would not simply stop working. It would cease to exist as a functional object. It would brick itself instantly, locking every circuit and gate until the debt was cleared. Mark imagined the silence of a dead machine. A sudden, total blackout of his workspace. No warning, no grace period. Just the cold finality of a locked motherboard. The server constantly verified his status, checking his digital wallet against his hardware usage. It was a digital leash, tightening with every frame rendered. He moved his mouse, watching the cursor glide with smooth, expensive precision. He was paying for the privilege of speed, for the right to see high-resolution images. If he missed a single payment, the hardware would turn into a useless slab of plastic and metal. The server was always watching, and always ready to pull the plug. The transition did not happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated erosion of autonomy. It began with software, small monthly fees for programs that used to be bought once and owned forever. Then, it moved to cloud storage, where personal files were held hostage behind recurring charges. People accepted it because it was convenient, never realizing the trap was being built around them. The shift finally swallowed the physical world when hardware manufacturers realized they could monetize the very atoms of existence. Every component, from the cooling fan to the motherboard, was integrated into a global tracking network. Nothing was sold anymore. Everything was licensed. The corporations stopped competing for customers and started competing for control over the user's daily life. Mark watched the history of this shift play out in his mind, a timeline of surrender. First, the digital tools were locked away. Then, the physical devices followed. Now, even the chair he sat in and the light bulb above his desk were part of a service agreement. He was living in a world where ownership had been rebranded as an obsolete concept. The transition was complete. Everything was a lease, and every lease was a tether to a server that never slept. A chime cut through the silence of the room. It was not a sound of urgency, but of routine administration. A window snapped open on Mark's monitor, glowing with the corporate logo of his hardware provider. The text was crisp and devoid of empathy. Your laptop battery health is below 80%. A replacement unit is on the way. Mark reached for the keyboard to dismiss the alert, but the button was grayed out. The system had already processed the diagnostic data. He watched the progress bar fill as the server confirmed the shipment of a new chassis. There was no option to decline, no way to repair the existing unit, and no choice to continue using the hardware he had grown accustomed to. The notification continued. Please return the current chassis within 24 hours to avoid a penalty. He looked at the battery indicator in the corner of his screen. It was a digital representation of a physical component he could not touch, let alone replace himself. The corporation had decided the machine was nearing its end of life cycle, and his input was entirely irrelevant to the process. He sat back as the system generated a return label, printing it automatically to his wireless printer. Mark stood up and walked to the printer. He pulled the pre-labeled shipping sheet from the tray, the paper still warm from the internal rollers. He returned to his desk and began the ritual. He unplugged the power cable, then the peripheral cords, coiling them with practiced, robotic movements. He lifted the laptop from the desk. It felt light, almost hollow, as if the components inside had already been stripped of their value. He placed the unit into the provided box, fitting it into the molded plastic inserts that held it perfectly in place. There was no resistance, no struggle, just the precise alignment of machine to container. He looked at the screen one last time, a blank, dark surface reflecting his own tired face. He felt nothing for the device. No frustration, no regret, not even the mild annoyance of losing his workspace. It was merely a temporary vessel for his data, a borrowed shell that had served its programmed duration. He folded the flaps of the box, the cardboard stiff and unyielding, and pressed the adhesive tape down with a sharp, tearing sound. He smoothed the edges, ensuring the seal was airtight. He sat back down at the empty desk, staring at the spot where the device had been. The desk was clean, devoid of any personal mark, as if he had never been there at all. The desk remained bare, a stark white rectangle in the dim light. Mark ran his hand across the surface, feeling the cold, synthetic material. This was the Silicon Wasteland. It was not a place of broken glass or rusted metal, but a silent, invisible web of total dependency. Every device in his room, from the cooling fan humming in the corner to the motherboard beneath his feet, was a node in a vast, remote network. He imagined the data streams pulsing through the walls, tethering every circuit to a central server miles away. There was no autonomy here. The server kept a constant, unblinking watch over the hardware, logging every cycle, every heat spike, and every power draw. If a fan slowed by even a few rotations, the server knew. If a capacitor showed signs of fatigue, the server initiated a replacement before Mark even noticed the lag. He was not a user. He was a tenant in a machine that monitored his every interaction. He stood up and paced the small room, realizing that his entire environment was a curated simulation of utility. The hardware did not belong to him, and the data he produced was merely a byproduct. Mark sat back at his new terminal, the screen glowing with a soft, sterile blue. He reached for the input device, his fingers hovering over the keys. He wanted to adjust the fan speed, just a fraction, to quiet the persistent, high-pitched whine echoing against the walls. He opened the system settings, bypassed the primary menu, and navigated into the deep configuration files. He highlighted a single line of code, intending to override the thermal threshold. As soon as his cursor clicked to save, the screen went black. A single red light pulsed on the chassis, a rhythmic, warning heartbeat. The system did not ask for confirmation. It did not offer a secondary option. It simply severed the connection. The keyboard went dead under his palms, the keys refusing to register a single press. He tried to force a reboot, but the power button remained unresponsive, cold to the touch. The server had detected the unauthorized entry point in milliseconds. It had identified the intent before the command was even fully executed. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. He was locked out of his own workspace, trapped by a digital barrier that he could neither see nor dismantle. He stared at the dark monitor, realizing that any attempt to claim control was met with an immediate, absolute erasure of his access. The screen flickered back to life after an hour of total silence, the system restoring access with a cold, mechanical indifference. Mark did not look at the desktop icons. He looked past them, searching for the gaps in the code. He found it buried in a legacy diagnostic partition, a small, unpatched vulnerability that the central server had failed to flag during the last update. His pulse quickened. This was the opening. He pulled a small, unmarked drive from his pocket, the only object in the room that did not belong to the network. He plugged it into the hidden port behind the monitor, his movements sharp and deliberate. The drive hummed, a low vibration against the plastic casing. He began the sequence, typing commands that bypassed the primary kernel. Each keystroke felt like a strike against the walls of his cage. He was rewriting the thermal limits, forcing the hardware to push beyond its least specifications. The fans began to spin faster, a rising whine that filled the room. He watched the progress bar crawl forward, his eyes locked on the screen. The air in the room grew heavy with the heat of the overclocking processor. The progress bar hit 90%. The processor heat radiated through the desk, a dry, metallic warmth that prickled his skin. Mark watched the custom driver files unpack, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. The fans reached a frantic, screaming pitch, vibrating the entire frame of the terminal. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the lines of code as they bypassed the primary security handshake. For a fleeting second, the system accepted the input. The screen brightness surged. He felt a sharp, electric thrill of victory. Then, the machine stopped. The fans cut to absolute silence. The screen froze, the cursor locking mid-motion. A crimson border bled into the edges of the display, expanding until the entire room was bathed in a harsh, artificial light. A single notification window snapped into the center of his vision. The text appeared in crisp, white letters against the red background. Unauthorized hardware modification detected. Mark stared at the words. He reached for the keyboard to force an exit, but the keys were dead. The warning pulsed, a digital heartbeat of judgment. The red warning window vanished, replaced by a rapid, chaotic strobe of error codes. The entire interface began to tear, pixels fracturing and bleeding across the display as the central server initiated the punitive protocol. Mark watched as his high-definition workspace dissolved into a jagged, low-resolution mess. A progress bar appeared, not for an update, but for a demotion. It crawled backward, stripping away his access rights one by one. The system was systematically dismantling his digital life. He tried to click away, but the cursor moved with a sluggish, heavy delay as if fighting through thick oil. The screen glitched violently, a sharp, high-pitched whine emitting from the monitor speakers. Then, the final notification arrived. Subscription tier downgraded to basic. The vibrant colors of his desktop drained away, leaving behind a flat, gray, utilitarian interface. His custom software, his saved projects, and his high-speed rendering tools were gone, replaced by locked icons and grayed-out menus. The machine had been hollowed out. Mark sat motionless, his hands hovering over the keyboard. The interface settled into its new, crippled state. Mark moved the mouse, but the cursor dragged across the screen like a lead weight. He clicked on a simple text file. The machine hesitated, the processor fans spinning up in a desperate, grinding whine before the window finally snapped open. Every action was now a chore. He tried to scroll down, but the text jumped in jagged, uneven bursts, the refresh rate dropping so low that the screen seemed to blink with every movement. The resolution was a blur of blocky, oversized pixels. Icons that once held sharp detail were now muddy, unrecognizable shapes. He attempted to close the window, but the system hung, the screen freezing for 3 full seconds before the command registered. The machine was no longer a tool, it was a barrier. He watched the frame rate counter in the corner, a tiny, glowing digit that flickered between 5 and 8 frames per second. It was a visual death sentence for his productivity. The monitor light cast a harsh, flickering glare against the walls, pulsing in sync with the stuttering display. He was trapped in a digital slow motion, forced to watch his work collapse into a fragmented, low-fidelity crawl. The machine had effectively neutered his ability to function, turning his once fluid workspace into a broken, unresponsive relic. Mark reached for the power button, his finger hovering over the plastic switch. He pressed it, but the machine did not shut down. Instead, the monitor flashed a message. Unauthorized power cycle detected. Please remain connected to the network to maintain your current service tier. He pulled his hand back as if burned. The machine was not just a tool, it was a sentry. He tried to disconnect the Ethernet cable, but the port light pulsed a steady, warning amber. The server was monitoring the physical connection status in real time. He stood up and paced the narrow floor, his footsteps echoing against the walls. Every movement felt watched. He looked at the screen again, where the cursor remained frozen in the center of the gray, low-resolution desktop. There was no way to bypass the software. He was trapped in a recursive loop of leasing his own productivity. The machine demanded a payment to function, and the payment required the machine to earn it. He realized then that he was not a user, but a component in a larger, corporate-owned machine, replaceable and entirely dependent on the next transaction. Mark turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the room. The desk, the lamp, the ergonomic chair, the sleek tower humming under the table. Every item bore the same matte black finish and the same subtle embossed logo of the leasing conglomerate. He reached out and touched the edge of his monitor. It felt cold, smooth, and entirely impersonal. He looked for a scratch, a smudge, or any sign of wear that might suggest he had actually lived with these objects. There were none. The room looked like a showroom, sterile and waiting for the next tenant. He stood up and walked to the wall, checking the labels on the back of his router. Every component was tracked, serialized, and strictly monitored. He realized he could not name a single item in the room that he truly owned. Not the chair he sat in, not the light that illuminated his work, not even the storage drive holding his memories. He was surrounded by technology, yet he possessed nothing. Mark remained seated, his hands resting on the cold surface of the desk. He reached out to toggle the desk lamp, but the switch offered no resistance. It was a soft-touch sensor, and it stayed dark. A tiny red light on the base blinked, waiting for a server ping to authorize the illumination. He was a ghost in his own home, a phantom haunting a space that functioned only when he paid for the privilege. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. All of it felt like a stage set. He was not a resident. He was a temporary node in a vast corporate network. Every breath he took in this room felt borrowed. He stood up, but the motion felt hollow, as if his presence here was barely registered by the environment. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, where thousands of other windows glowed with the same sterile, subscription-based light. He realized he was paying a monthly fee just to keep the lights on. The room did not know him. The devices did not recognize him. He was merely an account number, a recurring revenue stream that the system kept alive. He felt the weight of his own insignificance, a temporary guest in a world that had long ago replaced ownership with an endless, grinding cycle of access. Mark slumped back into the chair, the synthetic fabric cool against his skin. He closed his eyes, hoping to block out the sterile, flickering light of the monitor. The darkness behind his eyelids offered no sanctuary. Instead, he found himself counting the seconds, his pulse syncing with the rhythmic, faint hum of the cooling fans. He was no longer thinking about his own needs or desires. His mind had narrowed to a single hollow point of anticipation. He waited for the chime. He waited for the text to appear on the screen. He waited for the machine to tell him what he was allowed to do next. His hands lay flat on his lap, motionless. He did not fidget, He did not reach for anything. He had become a passive receiver of instructions, a biological component waiting for the next system update to define his reality. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressing against his ears. Every muscle in his body was locked in a state of suspended animation. He breathed shallowly, keeping his eyes shut tight, anchored to the chair by the crushing weight of his own compliance. He was ready for the next command. The monitor flared. A sharp, rhythmic pulse of light cut through the dim room, casting long, distorted shadows against the wall. Mark did not flinch. He opened his eyes, the screen's harsh glow washing over his face and reflecting in his pupils. A new notification box snapped into the center of the display. Subscription renewal required to maintain current access levels. The text was crisp, clinical, and final. His finger moved to the mouse. He did not pause to read the terms. He did not look at the balance of his digital wallet. The cursor hovered over the pay button for a fraction of a second. He clicked. The transaction processed instantly, a silent exchange of data that kept his digital life from collapsing. The notification vanished, replaced by the familiar, sterile desktop interface. He watched the progress bar reset, his breathing steady. It was a component that had been successfully serviced, ready to function for another month of rented existence. The room light cycled off, programmed to save energy during idle hours. Only the monitor remained, a singular humming beacon in the dark. Its cold blue light spilled across the desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air before washing over Mark. He did not move to turn the lights back on. He did not reach for a switch. He simply stared. The screen's glow deepened, casting sharp, angular shadows across his face and settling into the stillness of his expression. In his eyes, the blue light shimmered, a steady, unwavering reflection of the interface that now governed his every action. There was no flicker of defiance, no spark of frustration left. He had become an extension of the hardware, a biological terminal waiting for the next signal. The monitor pulsed once, a soft, rhythmic heartbeat of data, and he mirrored the cadence with a slow, shallow breath. He was no longer a person in a room, but a ghost trapped within the machine's reach. He sat in the silence, watching the blue glow until it was all that remained of his world.